Good morning, all. Brian S. Pratt here. Going to read chapter 17 of Shepherd's Quest, book 1 of the Broken Key Trilogy. So it's starting to get pretty good. Kevik has joined the team. They just entered Goblin territory. They came across Kevik and his master being attacked by goblins. They rescued him, but unfortunately, his master did not save him. So now they've got this. Kevik is a magic user apprentice, has a few spells. What they are, we're not really sure yet, but he does use them to great effect throughout the series, and I really like Kevik. He's one of my favorite characters I ever made. But anyway, so here's chapter 17, and then this is right after the. And chapter 17 starts right after they rescue Kevik and they're fleeing the goblins. They rode in silence as each listened for the pursuit that they feared would materialize at any moment. What words that did pass between them were hushed and few. Once they had ridden for an hour and still no pursuit presented itself, they began to relax. All attempts by Riyan to engage their new companion in conversation was met by silence. The apprentice didn't seem really there. He was withdrawn, dwelling upon his own misery. Another hour of riding had the fire far behind them. Its glow could still be seen where it raged in the night. Riyan figured the fire wouldn't come their way, seeing as how a gentle breeze blew in from the north. If it had been blowing from the south, he would have had more concern. He would have been more concerned. "I can't believe he's gone," the apprentice suddenly said. So shocked by the declaration was Riyan that at first he wasn't exactly sure what had been said. He remained quiet as the apprentice continued to speak. "We came here to gather components for a spell he was working on," he said quietly. "He lost his life for nothing." Bitterness, anger, and sadness could all be heard in his voice. "What was his name?" Riyan asked. He wanted to keep the apprentice talking, so he wouldn't withdraw back into himself again. "Alar," he replied. "I'm sure Alar felt the need was worth the risk," he assured him. "He did," the apprentice stated. Then he quieted for a moment as the sobbing returned for a short time. "He said they could only be harvested this time of year. That to do so at any other would negate their usefulness." Riyan waited for him to continue, but he lapsed into silence once more. When it didn't look as if the apprentice was going to continue the conversation, he asked, "What's your name?" "Kevik," he replied. "That's not my true name. Magic users aren't supposed to go by their true name. Kevik was the name my master gave me when he took me on as his apprentice." "Very well then, Kevik," Riyan said. "It might be a good idea for you to travel with us until we can return you back across the mountains." "Thank you," he replied. "I would appreciate that." They rode in silence for some time after that. Kevik seemed to have his emotions under control, for there were no more outbursts of sobbing. As they rode, the moon overhead continued its arc across the star-filled sky. Then in the early part of the morning, from out of the trees before them, 3 goblin warriors suddenly appeared. Both sides were startled to see the other. Kevik cried out a word unintelligible to the others, and green goo suddenly materialized around the goblins. "Ride!" yelled Bart as he kicked his horse into motion. As he raced past the goblins, his horse accidentally brushed up against one of the goo-coated goblins. His horse stumbled when the goo covering the goblin attached itself to the upper part of his horse's rear left leg. Bart looked back and saw where the goblin was being dragged along with every step his horse took. The goo was acting like glue as it held the goblin to his horse's leg. Turning in his saddle, Bart kicked out with his foot in an attempt to dislodge the goblin, but only managed to get his foot stuck in the green mass. The goblin was screaming as it struggled to free itself, but the goo was too strong, making its attempts futile. "Riyan!" Bart yelled to his friends, who had already disappeared into the trees ahead. "Chad!" He tried to get his horse to move forward, but the added weight in the position it was made it all but impossible for it to keep going. Suddenly, Riyan and Chad reappeared out of the trees and immediately saw his predicament. "Kevik!" Riyan yelled to the apprentice in the saddle behind him. "What can we do?" Kevik looked around him and saw the goblin, the horse, and Bart all stuck together. "I can cast the counterspell to dispel it," he explained, "but it will remove it from the others as well." "Do it!" shouted Bart. Kevik nodded, and with a wave of his hand and 2 words of magic, the green goo vanished. Immediately, the goblin fell free, and Bart righted himself back in the saddle. Let's go, Riyan yelled. The other two goblins that were just freed from the goo shouted as they crashed through the brush in pursuit. They turned their horses away from the sound of the approaching goblins and bolted through the trees. Behind them, the goblins shouted in their guttural tongue as they gave chase. Then from just ahead and to the right, other goblins were heard as they moved to intercept. In the darkness of the forest, I had the comma sitting between the S and the T of forest, not on the right side of the T. How I missed that, I have no idea. They were unable to see exactly where the goblins were, but they couldn't be very far away. Find us a way out of this, Chad yelled to Bart, who was now back in the lead. What do you think I'm trying to do, came the reply. The goblins chased them for what seemed like an hour. Though they never saw their pursuers, they could tell by the continued calls and shouts the goblins made that they weren't increasing their lead. Lights slowly began to brighten the sky, and the stars winked out one by one as the coming dawn hid their beauty. In the light of dawn, they were able to catch glimpses of their pursuers from time to time running behind them. It was incredible that they could still be in pursuit and hadn't fallen behind by now. The only reason Riyan could come up with was that the sheer size of the horses hampered their movement through the tangled undergrowth of the forest, while the goblins, being smaller in stature, were better able to force through on foot. Stop! Kevik suddenly yelled. Riyan failed to heed his warning as he glanced back to him over his shoulder. We can't, he yelled. If we stop, they'll kill us. But you don't understand, he began. We're not stopping, Bart yelled from his position at the lead. Kevik opened his mouth to urge them to stop once more, but instead kept silent. He knew it wouldn't do any good. How could he make them understand that it might be worse to continue than to stand and face the goblins? He had seen the totem that they had just passed and understood its significance. The goblins have many totems, and his master taught him the meaning of the more common visages they used before setting out. Each of the visages held different meanings for those who understood them. Also, the meanings could convey varying degrees of warning depending on which visage were combined into the totem and which position they each held. The one they had just passed had been overgrown by the forest, and he had caught but a glimpse of it as they raced past. His master had been most emphatic about one certain visage, one that should they come across, must be avoided at all costs. One quick thing. Kevik wasn't able to see the other visages on the totem due to the brush and the speed of their passing, but he had seen the one at the top very clearly. Goblin totems always had three visages or other representations that gave the totem its meaning. The one on top is the primary message the totem is there to convey, while the other two give added emphasis as to either the degree in which the top one should be taken or something else. The one that he saw had simply meant death. Riyan was soon to realize that the sound of pursuit behind them had begun to fade away in the distance. He wasn't sure why, but the goblins were breaking off their pursuit. Looks like they finally gave up, he said. They began slowing down to an easy walk now, seeing as how there was no longer any immediate danger. Chad grinned. Guess they realized they couldn't catch us, he said. No, announced Kevik. That's not the reason they are no longer following us. Oh? Asked Chad. Care to enlighten us? Back when I shouted for us to stop, I saw one of their totems, he explained. You may not realize it, but the totems are like markers, warning signs, if you will. The one we passed proclaimed that to proceed beyond it meant death for any that do. Death? Asked Bart. Bringing his horse to a stop, he turned around and came back to Riyan and Kevik. What sort of death? It didn't go into that much detail, and I only saw the visage at the top, he replied. My master warned me about that one. He said that they only used it when extreme danger was present. Chad glanced around at the forest around them. It doesn't look all that dangerous, he commented. Be that as it may, it warned of danger, and I think we should be on our guard, asserted Kevik. Just because there is no visible danger now doesn't mean we won't run into what that totem was there to warn us about farther in. At that, Riyan and Bart suddenly grew quiet. Riyan glanced at Bart and could see that he was thinking the same thing he was. Perhaps the totem was warning them about where they were headed. Chad saw their expression and asked, What? Ignoring his question, Ryan asked Kevik, "Do you know anything about this area?" He shook his head. "No. My master said he'd been here a couple times gathering various spell components. He probably would have known more than I." "Did he ever mention someplace old in these parts?" Ryan asked. "Say ruins or anything like that?" Kevik's eyes widened. "Is that why you're here?" Glancing first to Ryan, then to the others, he knew that it was. "You're a bunch of treasure hunters." "I suppose you could call us that," nodded Ryan. "We've been told there's a place around here that may hold great wealth." Kevik thought about it a second and nodded. He did mention that there were ruins of a place called Algoth somewhere around here." "What did he say?" asked Bart. Kevik noticed that they were keenly interested in what he was about to say. "Nothing much," he replied, "just that it was old." "Old? That's it?" "Yes," Kevik said. "He said, and I quote, 'There once was a realm here long ago, long before the goblins came. A colleague of mine years ago told me there were ruins of a place called Algoth on this side of the mountains.' From there, he went to a lecture about various spell components that grew in the region, the best time to harvest them, that sort of stuff. Did you know that the..." Yes. Bart said as he cut him off. "That must be the place we're looking for." Ryan nodded. "Would stand to reason." "Then if this Algoth is where we're headed," Chad said, "why would the goblins mark this place as deadly?" Shrugging, Bart said, "Who knows? Could be they're superstitious about this area. Maybe it's a taboo to them." "That's not what it said," corrected Kevik. "It proclaimed that to enter here was to die, period." "All right, calm down," Bart replied. "But you did say that the totem had been overgrown?" When he received a nod from Kevik, he continued, "Then it could be possible that whatever danger there had been at one time may no longer be present." "I wouldn't trust to that," Kevik said. "What do you two think?" Ryan asked Chad and Bart. "Should we heed the warning of the totem and turn back?" "Turn back?" asked Chad incredulously. After all we've done to get this far? You have got to be kidding." "We accepted the possibility of death before we even left the marketplace," Bart said. "I don't see how this could be any different." "That's true," agreed Ryan. "We press on then?" Chad and Bart both nodded their agreement. Ryan nodded as well. He then turned back to Kevin and said, "If you don't want to accompany us, we'll understand." "I don't have much choice. One way or the other," he replied. "The unknown danger ahead with you, or take my chance with the goblins behind on my own. Better the unknown than certain death." "Excellent," Ryan said with a grin. "I was hoping you would say that. Glad to have you with us." Kevin gave them a half-hearted grin. Bart turned and resumed leading them northward. With the sun almost ready to crest the horizon to the east, it was easier for him to determine which way was north. He angled slightly more to the east after a bit in order to reach the river flowing south. According to the map on the key fragment, Algoth lay on the western shore of the small lake at the northern end of the river. As they made their way through the forest, they began to feel relatively safe. Seeing as how this area was warded from goblin incursion by the totem, they rode without fear of being discovered and attacked. Kevik remained quiet as he rode behind Ryan. He took in his new traveling companions and didn't think much of them. They were all as young as he was. Two of them gave the appearance that they may have never done this sort of thing before. The third, on the other hand, had a definite presence about him, a confidence, if you will. He wasn't entirely sure that linking his fate with these three was the wisest course of action. But, seeing how his alternative was to strike out alone, he had little choice. "There's the river," Bart said, after they had ridden for a while. Through the trees ahead, they saw the sun glinting off the water as it flowed southward. "How much farther to where we want to go, do you think?" Chad asked. "Won't know until we get there," replied Bart. Now that the river was in sight, they followed it upstream. Somewhere ahead was a ruin, or something else, situated near where the river left a small lake. Kevik at times during the ride would turn inward and remember his master, the things he taught him, the promise of what would have come had his master lived. He had been quite lucky that his master had chosen him to be his apprentice. A magic user of such power and skill was much sought after by those wishing to learn the arcane. He was not really sure why his master had chosen him out of all the others he tested that day. From Kevik's viewpoint, he hadn't done all that much better than the others in the task that they were set to do. But when Aller had announced that Kevik would be his apprentice, it would be difficult to describe the emotions he had felt. He grinned at the memory of some of the mistakes he made that first month. It's a wonder he still lived. All of a sudden, he snapped out of his reverie when his eyes passed over another of the totems. "Riyan, stop!" he hollered. "What? There's another of the totems. There's another totem." He explained. Pointing towards the river, he directed Ryan's attention to the totem that stood near the water's edge. It was several feet from the bank on this side and facing the water. "We need to see what the other two visages are. They may give some insight as to why this place is death to those who enter." "All right," Ryan said. "Bart!" He hollered up to him. "Kevik wants to stop and examine the totem over there." When Bart looked over and saw the totem, he nodded. Ryan rode over to it and Kevik dismounted. Kevik then moved to the other side and looked up at the faces upon the totem. He pointed to the top one and said, "That one declares that it is death for any who continue past the totem." The visage looked to be a representation of a goblin's skull. The visage just below it was one he recognized as well. "This one means strength." Just below the skull was carved the semblance of a tree. "Strength?" asked Chad, Kevik nodding. "Being in the second position as it is, I believe it's trying to convey how serious the one on top should be taken. Seeing as how it means strength, I think it is saying that death has a strong presence here." "Death itself?" asked Ryan. "Or could it mean the possibility of death?" "I don't know," he admitted. "My master just gave me a quick rundown on the most used visages and their meaning." "What about the third?" Chad asked. "The third was a circle with two wavy lines carved across its center." He shrugged. "I don't know," he replied. "It doesn't match any of the ones my master mentioned." "What is the significance of the third spot?" Bart asked. "If the top one is the overall message, and the second one, if I understand you correctly, tells the observer to what degree he needs to heed the first one, then what is the third one's function?" "It's supposed to give the observer some understanding of what lies ahead," he explained. "Say a totem was placed to warn of a pool of poisoned water. The top one would be the visage representing poison. The second one would state how bad the poison is, and the third would resemble a pool of water. In essence, it would say, poison, strong, pool of water." Bart looked back up at the totem before them. "So here we have death, strong, and a circle with two wavy lines," he stated. "Yes, exactly." "Would be nice to know what that third visage could mean," commented Ryan. They remained by the totem for several minutes as they tried to come up with ideas as to what it represented. That's when Chad happened to glance across the river and noticed a party of a dozen goblin warriors. "We've got company," he said. The others turned toward the far bank of the river. "They're not crossing," observed Bart. "No," agreed Ryan, "but it looked like they want to." The goblins were acting very agitated. One even went so far as to fire an arrow in their direction, but they easily avoided the missile after it peaked at the top of its arc and came at them. "Maybe it would be a good idea to move into the trees," suggested Chad. "Out of sight, out of mind, as it were." Bart snorted. "We may be out of sight, but I highly doubt if we'll be out of their minds." "Still, let's get out of here," Ryan said. Moving back to his horse, he mounted and lent a hand to Kevik as he swung up behind him. The other two were mounted by the time Kevik had settled in behind Ryan. Bart took the lead once more as they left the totem by the river. A few minutes later, the trees obstructed their view of the river and the totem. The goblins on the far side maintained their vigil until they were lost from sight. As they rode, each continued to think about what the totem they saw might mean. None of them were very thrilled by its presence, other than the fact it kept the goblins from coming after them. A short time after they left the totem, Bart noticed an outcropping of stone that seemed to stick up out of the ground ahead. Its presence seemed rather unusual, as the rest of the land was relatively even as it moved over the gently rolling hills. It was covered in moss and overgrown with bushes. The only reason he noticed it at all was that it protruded upward more than the lay of the land would warrant. The course they were taking led them in the general direction of the outcropping. As he rode closer, something about the mass-covered rock felt odd to him. When he neared it, he realized what it was. Partially hidden beneath the moss were unmistakable signs of carving. He brought his horse to a halt and dismounted. "What are you doing?" asked Ryan. Kevin looked around to where Bart made his way toward the outcropping. Bart didn't reply. Instead, he came to the rock and scraped off a section of the moss. He could hear Chad surprise and take a breath when the section of moss fell away. It had revealed an eye. The eye was on its side, and after removing more of the moss, they were able to tell that it was part of a head, most likely the head of a statue. The eyes and general features were somewhat eroded away, but the face was definitely that of a human. Looks like we've reached Algoth, Riyan said as he swung down from his horse. Bart glanced behind him and saw the others were coming to examine the statue for themselves. The head looked to have been broken off from a larger statue, since after they pushed back some of the bushes, the jagged neck was revealed. Chad moved farther down to see if he could find the rest of the statue, but only the head was there. "We better be on our guard from here on out," said Chad. Returning to the others, he added, "Whatever that the totem warned of is likely to be found within the ruins of Algoth." "What are you looking for?" Kevik asked. "Why is it so important for you to come here?" The others glanced from one to the other. He could see they didn't want to let him in on what they were up to. "Don't you trust me?" he asked, slightly hurt. "It's not that we don't trust you," Riyan explained. "It's just that we don't know you well enough. You understand that, right?" Kevik didn't like it, but could see the logic in what he was saying. He nodded and said, "Yes." Riyan gave him a grin and patted him on the shoulder. "Let's go see if we can't find what we're looking for." Returning to his horse, he again helped Kevik up behind him. The staff that his master gave him had been an ever-present companion. When riding, he always kept it clutched in his right hand. After they left the broken statue behind and continued on, Riyan asked him if he knew how to use it. "For the most part," he admitted. "It can paralyze an enemy. That one I know. My master never went into much detail about it. I'll have to have a king's scroll of identification in order to fully understand what it does." Now, if you remember, back when they went to Thyr, they talked about tiers of scrolls. You know, there's the peasant scrolls, like the one Chad bought to fix the crack in the grinding wheel that ended disastrously. Then there's the noble ones that kind of in the middle, and the king is the most powerful ones. See, what would a king's scroll of identification tell you? He asked. "Everything about it," Kevik replied. "But for now, I'll have to settle for what my spell of identification can reveal." "You know how to cast a spell of identification?" Riyan asked hopefully. "Well, just the basic one," he explained. "As I grow in mastery of their arcane arts, the effects of my spells will become more enhanced." Riyan grew silent for a moment as he contemplated what Kevin had just said. He wondered if perhaps Kevik's spell of identification would reveal anything about the fragment of the key. But then he thought that it might be best if he were to wait and purchase a scroll of that spell from a scriber like Fendir. That way, what he learned would remain with just him. He liked Kevik, but he just didn't know if he was one in whom he could trust the secret of what they were doing. "What other spells can you do?" he inquired. "Just a couple," he replied. "One of them you already saw. I can restrict the movement of another by encasing them in a green sticky substance." He grinned as he said, "The spell is called Glavir's Miraculous Spell of Binding. From what I've learned so far, every spell has a fancy name. I just call it my green goo spell." Then he laughed. He was surprised that it burst out of him. He really hadn't expected it. "What's so funny?" Riyan asked. "My master would get so mad when I refer to it by the green goo spell," he explained. Then he grew silent as the memory of his loss returned. He had almost been able to put it behind him. "What else?" "I can identify objects, inflict damage by sending red bursts of power, and half a dozen cantrips," he told him. "Must be neat to be able to do such things," he said. "It is," he admitted, "but it takes a lot of time to learn a new spell. I've been apprentice now for a little over a year, and I only know a handful of spells." "I'm sure that once you've done it longer, you'll be able to learn faster," stated Riyan. "So my master taught me." They continued making their way through the trees with Bart in the lead. They came across more evidence of the people who had once lived there. Overgrown sections of walls that once must have stood tall were now little more than shattered remnants of their former glory. The trees began to thin as they entered an area where the broken remnants of Algoth became more visible. All of it was overgrown and broken. Then all of a sudden, a structure appeared through the trees ahead. Rising tall, it was covered in moss and vines. The ground floor and the one above it seemed to be intact, but the jagged outline of the upper walls revealed that it had once stood taller. More structures were visible farther behind it. "Looked like it collapsed," Chad said as they rode toward the building. No doorway was visible, so they went around to the right to locate one. When they rounded the corner, they discovered that the right wall had crumbled and the interior of the building had completely collapsed in on itself. Over the years, dirt had been deposited to cover the rubble, and now trees and bushes grew out of the crumbled remains. One of the trees had grown very large and rose up out of the ruined building to the sky. Dismounting, they gave the building a once-over, but found nothing of interest. Moving on, they led their horses over to one of the nearby buildings. This one looked like it may have survived better. It was 3 stories tall, and other than a few cracks coursing through the walls, seemed to be intact. "This is it!" exclaimed Bart as he rushed forward. "This is what?" asked Kevin. When Ryan and Chad saw what had excited Bart, they too realized this was going to be important, for engraved on the front of the double doors that led into the building was a coat of arms they both had seen before. A sword pointed downward with a dragon grasping the hilt of as its body twined around the blade. Ryan grinned as he looked upon one of the coat of arms they had seen back in the diamond-shaped chamber deep within the crypt. And of course, the diamond-shaped chamber was where the king was, his sword and shield were on the wall, and then there were 3 other ones. So this one here must have been one of the king's lords. So this is probably the city of that lord. And that ends chapter 17. So we got Kevik's there. He's got a few spells. Spell of identification, which could come in handy. The green goose spell, which is very versatile, and he can fire some bolts too. So we'll see how that works out. Yeah, they come to trust Kevik. I really like Kevik, and I liked exploring the totems. I thought that was really neat. The way I had that, the way that there's 3 carvings. What I call visages in there, and each one has a specific meaning. I really like that. I don't have a master list of that. I'm sure I'll just, if I need them in the future, I'll just make them up. I'll make them up as I go. It'd be interesting to go back to see what the totems were that were on the edge of the marketplace. I didn't go into that, and I don't think I even have those listed because, Kevik wasn't there to explain it, and Ryan, Bart, and Chad would have just seen it as a carving and not paid any attention to it. Yeah. So they're in Algoth, and apparently it's death to go there, that you're going to die if you go there. So we'll see what happens. They're not dead yet, and since there's 2 more books after this one, apparently they're not going to die here. Maybe. And so, that would be an interesting thing. You start out on an adventure, and then 4 chapters in, every character dies, right? But they turn into ghosts, and then a whole different adventure starts when they're ghosts. That would be interesting, right? Because not many stories are really told from the other side. I mean, there's Beetlejuice, obviously. That was pretty interesting. I suppose Casper could be technically, but it really wasn't from Casper's point of view. But yeah, I have had a thought about a story. Okay. Have you seen the remake of The House on Haunted Hill? Not the black and white one with Vincent Price, but the newer one, where the amusement park magnate has a Halloween birthday party for his wife, and then they bring these people to the house on Haunted Hill, the old insane asylum where everybody went crazy and so forth. And I love that movie, and it's got my favorite Marilyn Manson song too, "Sweet Dreams." The way he sings it is just the creepiest possible way of singing "Sweet Dreams." It's perfect for this movie. Anyway, so my thought is, okay, if you haven't seen that movie, this is going to spoil it for you. Or at least a little bit of it. But everyone who dies in that building becomes part of the force in there, right? When it's chasing them, you can see, images of those who have fallen. By the time you see that, several have already died. Now, all of these people, when the force comes after them, you see their image. So I got to thinking of a story that begins and it's based on someone caught in that inside of that force, right? Like, he wakes up and he starts doing this thing, and then he goes and he terrifies somebody or something, and then it fades away. And then he comes back, he does the exact same thing again, and then he goes and terrorizes somebody else, maybe kills them, and then it fades away. It's like every time the spirit calls them to haunt or kill the intruders, he regains consciousness, limited. And then over time, he'll regain more. And then he's eventually going to try to free himself from this and free everybody else by helping the person that he's supposed to be trying to kill, along with all the other spirits that have been trapped and enslaved by the master spirit. So as the book progresses, he's going to work on contacting the newer people, because every time he comes back, and he's drawn to by the spirit to kill or scare away or whatever the human living intruders, he gains more and more consciousness. And I thought that would be an interesting concept, because he's trapped in a spirit. He's doing something that he doesn't want to do, and he has no control over it. He's forced to. He's enslaved to it. But somehow he's got to convince somebody to do something to free them. Like in the House on Haunted Hill, the first one ends where the two people escape and the spirit is still in the house. But the second one, Return to House on Haunted Hill, which I think is a pretty good movie too, it goes into the mythology of why it was happening. There's this totem, and they had to drop the totem down the sewer and let it flow out. And once it escaped the bounds of the house, then all the spirits were free. So it had to be something like that. But so the whole thing would be from the perspective of the spirit trapped by the master entity. I always thought that would be really cool. I've even actually written a couple chapters on it. And in this one here, when he wakes up, like there's about, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 minutes before he has to go do his thing, right? He's trying to... When I was in high school, I was in band, first chair trumpet, and every year we did a musical. And one year was The Man of La Mancha. And we would do the songs, we would watch the movie of it, and I absolutely loved it. And so when I started writing this, and this guy, when he starts to wake up before he's being sent out to kill, because like in the House on Haunted Hill, the house started to wake up when they got here, right? And then as the movie progressed, it got more and more active. So it's like when they first get in there, the master spirit would start waking up his slaves, his spirit slaves. And then as the people are in there longer, then they gain more and more energy from them or whatever, and more consciousness, until finally they're strong enough to do something. So it's in that time he would wake up and slowly grow in power, because he needs to be at a certain level in order to do what the spirit tells him to do. But while he's in that moment, he gains consciousness, and there's others in there with him too. And for whatever reason, when I started writing that, he's like doing the whole Cervantes. Is the scene where he's in the prison, and the prisoners are put him on trial. So he tells them that he's an actor, and he starts getting them to become part of the production of Man of La Mancha, right? And so in the story, this spirit guy is trying to get everyone to say their lines and trying to act out the Man of La Mancha, and it doesn't go well, obviously. It sounds stupid, but when I wrote it, it sounded pretty good. Yeah. I may never do that, but sometimes I'll get ideas, and I just have to write a chapter or two just to explore it. But that sounds really interesting. I don't think it'd be a horror movie per se. I'm not really. I don't think I can write a horror movie that well. Porn, I could probably I'm probably get porn. Anyway, I guess that's it. Yeah. What do you think? Does that sound like an interesting story? I've done right. I think it could be pretty interesting, and that would be a good movie too, because I think it have a lot of good visuals in it. Although they probably wouldn't want him to do the Man of La Mancha. No, probably the producer probably wouldn't go that route. That's all right. Yeah. So today, I'm driving down to Dallas. My boy's flying in. He spent the weekend with his mother in Phoenix. She got married to her father's best friend. That's right. Her father and stepmom passed away a couple years ago. Now she is marrying his best friend, whom when we were together she couldn't stand. She thought he was creepy, very weird. Had nothing good to say about him. But now they're getting married, and I don't think there's love involved. I think it's because he's got cancer really bad. I'm surprised he even made it to the wedding. And she's never held a job in her life. So these are just two people who need to have someone else in their life. And, she needs him to help take care of her, and he needs her so he won't die alone. So I kind of understand it. My kids were kind of against it all because they didn't care for Gary too much either. He was okay. He always treated me nice. But, so she's married, no longer has my last name, which I'm very happy about. I always didn't like the fact that she kept my last name. I wish she had gone back to her maiden name, but no, she wouldn't do that. Oh, she didn't bring much honor to my last name while she had it. I'm rambling, aren't I? Yeah, I'm rambling. All right. You all have a good day. I'll see you tomorrow. Chapter 18, and we'll see what all God has in store for us.